Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to the Cape Lead Revolution. This is Chachi with a great podcast today. And oddly enough, another one of my old bosses, as it were. He retired as a two-star general as the Vice Commander of Pacific Air Forces, Major General retired Mark Dillon. General Dillon, welcome to the Cape Lead Revolution.
It's great to be here, Chief. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you and I having met again most recently at Air Command and Staff College during their Lead X event 3.0. But for some of our viewers and listeners who perhaps are unfamiliar with you, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and giving us some of your background, please, sir.
You bet. As you mentioned, I think you mentioned, or those you can read my bio, my last job in the Air Force, I retired as the Vice Commander of Pacific Air Forces back in 2017. So that's one duty title I had the opportunity to fly airplanes for many years, big airplanes for the Air Force for about 25 years, several leadership opportunities. And I started out as an engineer, as a second lieutenant in the space business, and did that for about 4 years before I started flying airplanes. I'd be remiss though, as General Mark Welsh used to say, every airman has a story. And so, injecting part of my personal life into that bio as well. I've had the privilege to be a father, be a husband, and be a son for my parents, and proud of all three of those responsibilities, or if you want to think about them as duty titles. So my wife and I have three beautiful sons out doing good work in high school and college these days. I've been married to my bride coming up on 28 years this year, and I can readily admit she would agree that I married much better than she did, and proud to be my parents' son. My dad, God rest his soul, passed away about 6 years ago, but my mom's still kicking and doing great work. So proud of all three of those duty titles, as well as having an opportunity to lead out at PACAF, my last assignment.
Amazing. And most successful people that I've seen, whether it's military or not, are less concerned about some of their work duty titles and more concerned with, husband, father, teammate, so I definitely appreciate the humility you bring there.
Thank you.
But as far as the people who may not be familiar with the military organization and or alignment inside the United States Air Force, we're looking at, commanding for squadron, for group, and then you're a vice commander, and then commanding a wing, moving forward. That is amazing stuff. But your career started at Arizona State, which I think for a lot of people, including my wife as an ASU grad, you don't necessarily think of the environment or culture around Arizona State as one of those that would just lend itself towards military service. So what inspired the military service?
Yeah, great question. I at the time I was in college, I was pursuing an engineering degree, and I also was pursuing on a personal level. I enjoyed baseball. I still enjoy baseball today. So I had the opportunity to play a little bit of baseball while I was in college, but realized that my baseball skills weren't going to take me as far as possibly some other things. My dad, he was a Navy man for 20 years. And so I was familiar, as growing up as a military brat, knew a little bit about the military, and I was interested and thought I'd give a chance to fly an airplane. So I threw my name in the hat and was selected to go to officer training school and go to the Air Force. And I didn't start out, my first 4 years, I served as an engineer working in the space shuttle program, but I kept applying and kept my nose to the ground and applied for pilot training and got selected for flight school. And the rest, as they say, is history. So you're right. I didn't start out pursuing a military career, but one thing led to another, and here we are today.
So, as far as flying airplanes, we see a whole lot of press, or you see every commercial. There's not a whole lot of love given to the air mobility side of things, and or some of the strategic airlift that we end up having. And so a lot of your career spent out at Travis Air Force Base, and that was the first wing you commanded as far as that goes. But as far as the mission out there and then strategic airlift, how important was that for you, and how did even just maybe perhaps that mindset shape you as a leader for how you understand global integration and how we kind of link all of our teams together?
Yeah, great question. It is an amazing profession, broadly speaking, the profession of arms, and to actually be affiliated with the military. And, we all have our different roles, and at least inside the Air Force specialty codes, incredible mission and breadth. And so the mobility mission in terms of strategic airlift and air refueling and logistics is a key enabler for the entire military, and obviously for our nation. You see the mobility heroes even today doing great work supporting the National Command Authority to do work supporting the coronavirus pandemic. So sometimes, obviously, a lot of effort in the mobility business during wartime, but obviously a lot as in peacetime as well. And it's a strategic deterrent that the United States has that a lot of countries are envious of. So I certainly enjoyed my time in the mobility business. And while it's not necessarily at the forefront of what what Americans may think of when they actually their first thoughts of the military, it's certainly a key enabler and key capability that the United States of America has and should be awful darn proud of. And I know the folks in the mobility business certainly are.
I couldn't agree with that more. And it's funny because as a career airman myself, obviously, having worked in the combat Air Force, didn't have much experience with the mobility Air Force other than taking me to and from war, or there were the planes that I got to jump out of. But, getting to be a command chief inside of Air Mobility Command, I was absolutely blown away at the infrastructure and everything that has to happen inside the air mobility world
Right.
to let that go. And General McDew was the commander of U.S. Transcom, one of our combatant commands. And he said something very interesting. He goes, "I'm the only combatant commander that gets thanked by the other combatant commanders."
Yes, that's a great point.
What a phenomenal endeavor. And it's perhaps it's but behind the scenes or always the bridesmaid perhaps, but how is that like a career spent traveling the world with strategic airlift? How important was that to you?
It was certainly a learning experience and an eye-opening experience, and it enabled me to see, in terms of the CAPE and leadership opportunities, it exposed me early on in my career to other specialties and a lot of different specialties, and especially the support system that it took to make that huge mechanism called the mobility infrastructure work. You saw it from, your perspective, the business end many times, but, I would offer many times out on the ramp, out on the flight line, or in the back shops is really where a lot of the key work is actually taking place. And that doesn't necessarily make the headlines or make the front page photos either. But those young airmen, those senior enlisted that are enabling that mission, again, out on the flight lines, logistics piece, the aerial port work, the maintenance work is critical to getting those big, huge airplanes, whether they're strat airlift or those tankers, moving and accomplishing the mission each day.
And for me, one of the best leadership metaphors that I would love to use that not many people would understand is simply the en route system.
Yes.
Like inside the Air Force, they have all these depots all around the world under the same command, mind you. And that's not necessarily how all the military service, obviously you know this, but for our viewers and listeners out there, is that there are these Air Mobility Command assets all over the world that fall under Air Mobility Command, not some type of European command or Pacific command. They're
Right.
always Air Mobility Command to help push through and provide maintenance and support all this cargo and movement of personnel throughout the world. And I think like what a great leadership metaphor that hopefully inside an organization, there's always these people that are there to help support and make sure that you're going in the right direction, that you're getting your maintenance. And to me, that ends up being your commander, your chief, and your first sergeant. It's kind of the organizational en route system to provide support. I don't know if you've ever used that metaphor or thought about it, but I adore it.
Well, I think you're onto something there, Chief. The en route system, it amplifies the global mission and the time difference, and those of us who are part of that get an opportunity early in our career to see that global mission and the geographically separated units. And a lot of times they're not large units, but they punch way above their weight in terms of what they're accomplishing for that broader mobility infrastructure. So absolutely. And so back to your point, about alignment, you see alignment across the mobility system. Everyone understands, no matter where they're stationed or located, whether they're moving as part of the the airplanes that are moving and the humans that are moving, or whether they're part of that en route fixed structure. They are aligned to that global mission. So it's impressive to be a part of, and it's a great leadership laboratory to participate in, especially as a youngster. And you get a certain appreciation for that global mission the more senior you become, and realize how that's an enabling skill set.
Absolutely. And so kind of changing gears a little bit, since you brought up youngster, So as far as college students to Arizona State University, and then going to OTS.
Correct.
Before there, was it anywhere on your radar that your future could involve Major General Mark Dillon?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think once I became part of the military, once I commissioned and joined the team, again, I had, I grew up as a military brat, so I had those experiences. So I at least had an appreciation for some of the nomenclature and some of the lexicon. But yeah, it was. I was just really. I think like most of us who serve, we don't have. I think all of us readily agree that we don't have aspirational goals to earn a certain leadership position or title, but we enjoy doing so much what we're doing that really that supersedes any aspirations or goals. We just really enjoy the individuals we serve with. Not that they're any better than the folks who are, make up the rest of the great nation called the United States of America, but they are a different set of folks, and they have a different set of values, if you will, core values, for example, in our Air Force. But I really enjoyed myself, and I was just blessed to be able to serve for as long as I did. And yes, yeah, great group of folks, great opportunity, and I had no aspirations to be a major general. I think after I'd been in for probably about 10 years, I set my sights. I really would like the opportunity to command at the squadron level. So I was, I think it was not an unrealistic expectation to set my goals and to try to make some decisions that affected my career to go that route. But otherwise, no long-term aspirations. In fact, I can share a vignette with you if you don't mind. My dad, he had served, honorably retired from the United States Navy as 20 years as petty officer first class, and obviously learned a lot from my dad. I'll talk about later. But as I was probably in the 10-year, 12-year point in my career, my dad would often ask me when I called him, and talked to him, he'd say, well, okay, you're getting close to retirement, or you need to start thinking about retirement. And there was a point in my career, probably about the 15 to 18-year point, where I would say, you know what, Dad, Sarah and I, my wife and I, we're really enjoying what we're doing. I think we're going to serve longer than 20 years. I just think we really enjoy. I think we're just going to keep enjoying ourselves, realizing the turbulence with moving and PCSing and all that stuff. But we're really enjoying ourselves, and we really enjoy the people, and we realize how wise that was looking back, because we were able to continue to serve with great folks like yourself and our fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for almost 34 years when you add it all up. But yeah, just great opportunity, great chance to serve with great people, and no long-term aspirations. And I sort of disagreed with my father along the way and said, hey, Dad, we're going to ride this horse a little bit longer if we can, because it's just a great group of folks and enjoying the mission.
And that's one of the things. Like it just has to be fun.
It was.
I don't think people stay in regardless of goals or aspirations if they're not having fun along the way. What looking back on your career, what were some of the most fun moments that you were able to have, whether just as a pilot or a teammate or a leader? Just what was the most fun for you?
Wow, there's
probably a lot to unpack there.
We might be here for a while. Chief, one of the things that I enjoyed professionally the most, and it stretched me and challenged me the most, was when I was a flying squadron commander of C5 Squadron at Travis Air Force Base, 22nd Airlift Squadron. And when we had the opportunity to deploy in support of Operation Enduring Freedom back in 2002, the most challenging, the most difficult, the most unconventional, because C5 hadn't been deployed in over 25 years. So a lot of the skill sets that you normally learn having your tactics, techniques, and procedures had atrophied. So incredibly challenging. But while we were accomplishing that mission, it was incredibly rewarding. And obviously afterwards, much of what we tried to assemble to do that deployment was the baseline for what the C5 still uses today for deploying operations. So what's become standard now for an expeditionary Air Force was not standard and especially for that weapon system. So that was very rewarding. And that was a fun time. I never worked so hard in my entire life. I think in my career, challenged myself, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, physically, but at the same time, just what a true pleasure, because not only did I have that experience, but I would offer that the individuals who were part of that deployment, that were part of that team, they would probably share that similar experience. What a fun, dangerous experience, but a fun experience at the same time. And so that's probably number one. I have a lot of great flying stories and had a lot of fun time flying airplanes and doing all kinds of great stuff. But from a personal perspective and a professional, that was certainly the highlight.
And it's funny that the reason I asked that question is that obviously military service is a sacrifice. It is born of tough times. It is born of very difficult environments. But nearly everyone that I talk to, when I ask them a similar type of question, they end up choosing like the most austere of circumstances and the most challenging times. But again, it was the teams that they had, the camaraderie, the mission, that what I would call the purity of focus in those moments where they found some of their greatest stuff. So along those lines, if we kind of switch over to the leadership part of that, how would you describe your leadership journey as far as from a young lieutenant, working over near NASA, to pilot, to growing throughout to leadership positions, to where you retired as the vice commander of a major command inside the United States Air Force? How would you describe that experience or your growth in that endeavor?
You bet. Thanks for the question, Chief. One of the things that upon reflection, one of the constant themes that I've had throughout my career is the ability to serve with incredible NCOs and senior NCOs. And while I'd be remiss, if I didn't obviously shout out to all the great officers and civilians I've worked with, the continuum that I've been blessed with in my career, and where I think I've learned the most, has been from NCOs and senior NCOs. And quite frankly, it actually started with my father. And as a young person, you realize the wisdom of your parents the older you get. Wow, my dad was really stupid when I was in high school, but man, he's brilliant, by the time I'm 35. So in hindsight, you always reflect back and, boy, I wish I would have known, what's the old saying, wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then.
Right.
But but throughout my career, whether I was my first assignment working in the space business, Tech Sergeant Wayne Renau I worked with out at my first assignment at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and then followed by Master Sergeant Nick Bacon, at Space Launch Complex 6 when I was working in the Titan program. My first flying assignment, Chief Master Sergeant Benny Rice, who taught me about leadership, that you actually, I still remember the phrase, you catch a lot more bees with honey than with salt. Basically as a leader, you don't need to have that gruff and grim and tough perspective. You can be a little softer and be a lot more effective. I served with when I started flying C5s, one of the flight engineers and senior enlisted that left a mark was retired as Chief Master Sergeant Timothy Bruning, flight engineer, brilliant guy, knew everything about the C5. I mean, he knew about every bolt and nut, and he taught me as a pilot that I should probably expand my portfolio. And while it's good to have pilot knowledge, it may be good to have some other knowledge of the aircraft. And that, of course, led me on an adventure to learn about the other Air Force specialty codes that supported the aircraft. And obviously, when I got into command positions and more senior positions, I had my superintendent when I was at Altus Air Force Base, Chief Master Sergeant Ray Brzezowski, just a great wingman. I had Chief Master Sergeant Mike Williams when I was at the 60th Air Mobility Wing, a great command chief. Used to come in my office and sometimes he'd close the door and he says, sir, we're having a conversation about, fill in the blank on the issue. And he says, we both know what the answer is. That's why we're having this conversation, but we have to walk ourselves through why we're going to make this decision, right? I said, Chief, yeah, absolutely. Yes. I had the privilege, of course, as you mentioned, I served a couple times as wing commander, and was at the 86th Airlift Wing at Ramstein, and Chief Master Sergeant Vernon Butler was my command chief, and I had an acting command chief for a while. Chief Master Sergeant Andrea Gates, who went on, I think she was the senior enlisted leader at DISA, but two great senior enlisted, again, great advice, great leadership. Many times your senior enlisted and your NCOs that I learned throughout my career were just that voice of reason. Many times in a storm of, you pick the issue, whether it's a personnel issue, a catastrophic event, et cetera, et cetera. They're just the voice of reason. And so it all started with my dad, who as a youngster would say, hey, you know what? You need to listen to your enlisted young officer. They have a lot of wisdom, and actually, in our military system that we have, most of the time, especially at the leadership level, the officers have a high turnover rate. They have a high movement rate, and those enlisted, junior and senior enlisted, tend to remain on station for quite a bit longer, and they provide that continuity. We often say, no disrespect to our civilian folks, but our enlisted folks and senior enlisted have a wealth of knowledge. And so what is the key to leadership, or one of the keys of my success, has been always taking the advice of my dad and listening to those junior and senior enlisted leaders and those NCOs in the organization, who provided just a wealth of knowledge throughout my career.
Well, number one, I appreciate the answer. Number two, thank you for that amazing shout out to for the enlisted corps, and the kind of perspective that they can end up bringing. And, as a matter of fact, Jim Bessel that we had the honor of speaking with down there at Maxwell, he was on the podcast last week, and I'm getting ready to
fantastic.
Go public with his episode here shortly. But it was funny because he said, you know what, he goes, the civilian world needs that senior enlisted leader to be there, to be that kind of voice of reason. Well, there is, and again, a voice of reason can be devil's advocate. It could be harsh critic. It could be the guy who gives the hug behind the scene. And so, I always appreciated that role. And I appreciate that Jim, with no military background, was able to see the value in that as well, and kind of wish that upon the civilian force.
Yes, I agree. And the more time I spend in the, working in the private sector and in the civilian world, I truly agree with that. Many, organizations, and rightfully so, are very lean organizations, but at the same time, they suffer not having that voice of reason, that sound judgment, that wealth of experience and wisdom that comes from being in the corporation, if you will, for many years, and moving around. As you were command chief, and you're TAC P. You were command chief at a wing that had really, quite frankly, nothing to do or little to do with being TAC P business, but your expertise and your experience in the corporation was applied in that as a leadership opportunity, and your corporate knowledge was amazing. And obviously, General Cole and your team there realized the importance and the wisdom you provided.
It was a lot of fun, and huge credit to the whole 305th Air Mobility Wing team for inviting me with open arms, and really allowing me to have that say. Because like, even during my interview, the majority of my time was spent with General Cole. Colonel John Price retired me in his waning 6 months, and I give him huge credit. There's zero reason to hire a TAC P, a guy who calls in airstrikes for his entire career, into the air mobility world. Had no, I'm not a career enlisted aviator. I'm not a maintainer. I'm not a port dog. Like, three phenomenal reasons, to not hire me. But he wanted that outside perspective, and maybe a fresh perspective, and wanted me to call some ugly babies ugly because I don't know who the parents were. So like that, like I huge credit. And perhaps maybe that's why I have such a fan of understanding perspectives and putting that inside my methodology, because I want to Colonel Price and General Cole to keep me on there and to help me try and help them find success. Huge credit to them for that foresight.
And as you know, our institution, at least for the Air Force, it's about 80% of the corporation, if you will, called the Air Force, is comprised of enlisted. So you need that, in the CAPE methodology, you need that perspective. An interesting thought is, what would the expectations of an organization be inside our Air Force if we didn't have a senior enlisted to accompany that senior officer? Boy, that would be a big change. So you contrast that with, as you were talking earlier about in the civilian world, they don't normally have that. So great contrast.
Absolutely. And so looking back through your career, we talked about, your younger self looking up, and now, if we're looking at your 2-star self, looking back, what would
Mhm.
Major General Dillon say to Lieutenant Dillon about their career and about the journey that was lying in front of them?
Yes, I'll piggyback a little bit on my answer earlier with about the senior NCO piece, but really listening to your mid-level leaders and 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 those who have gone before us. You know, we talk about standing on the shoulders of the giants who went before us, and the wisdom of our elders, if you will. I think the Romans called it mos maiorum. You know, the wisdom of the elders, and that's how they, you know, were successful culturally. So I think had I think as a younger individual, had I reflected more on the wisdom of our elders, no disrespect to the younger generation, you know, if I were growing up today and I see my sons, you know, they focus a lot on modern technology and all the beeps and squeaks, but I think a lot gets lost in terms of the individual and the personal contact. And I think we're all experiencing that now with the pandemic and, you know, physical separation and distancing of ourselves, and that ability to have human contact. So that human contact and that ability to reflect back on our elders and spending time there, I wish I'd have done a better job of heeding that advice as Lieutenant Dillon.
Gotcha. You know, and there's, as I look back on my career, several different things that I would have done differently. And I think the antithesis for that is I would have been more proactive in talking to my leadership. You know,
Yes,
I think there's something that we're not necessarily taught, and there's a little bit of that institutional fear that I
right,
didn't feel like I could always go to my commander and, you know, have a good, you know, honest conversation with him, but not realizing at the time that he needs that feedback that helps put his finger on the pulse of what's going on. And so, you
right,
know, that balance of understanding back and forth where, you know, if you were to go back and listen to enlisted people earlier, I definitely think that I should have done a better job at speaking up more. Now, again, politely, professionally, but
right.
at least give my commander the benefit of my opinion and perhaps even my limited perspective. I just wish I would have communicated better and more often.
Right. And well, as you know, is a key part, you know, of that communication piece. You know, listening is so important. And I guarantee you, I was a terrible listener, you know, as a young person. And, you know, my relationship with my dad, you know, not thinking he knew anything when I was a youngster. But yes, you know, the good Lord gave us two ears, you know, and one mouth. And we should, you know, probably in 2020 hindsight, spend a lot more time listening than talking. And that's a challenge across the leadership spectrum, but certainly as a young person.
You bet. And so with that, will take us to our first break. So stay tuned. We will be right back with Major General retired Mark Dillon. Stay tuned. Be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back from break again here with Major General Mark Dillon. General Dillon, you know, we talked about a lot of you know, your kind of humble beginnings and some of the stuff that you learned throughout the way. It's a little bit about the success that you've had along the way, the different levels that you've been able to command and lead. You know, there's often a mid-level manager that gets a little bit ignored. Perhaps
Mhm.
they're not getting the requisite focus. Perhaps some of these people aren't the bright and shiny pennies, so they're not getting further polished or any of that stuff. But so I think there's a lot of people, and I think in really any organization, not necessarily the United States Air Force or the military writ large, who are just trying to find their way through that middle management piece. What advice would you have for them to find success, regardless of organization, for some things that maybe they can do to set themselves up for success?
You bet, Chief. Yes, great question, and you're right. They're kind of the folks in the middle of an organization and looking to continue to grow. One of the things I would suggest to them is ask questions, and another thing is to seek out others who have been down that journey before. Look for the shoulders of the giants to stand on, perhaps, to read and to study about, you know, this particular topic we're here sharing today is about leadership. So read and study about leadership. Learn from those who have done before. Be willing to take risks. Be willing to put yourself out there and to, you know, when your leader of the organization looks around and says, hey, I need someone to do this, you know, fill in the blank. Be that individual that sticks your hand in the air, realizing that while they may not be asking you for that primo leadership opportunity in the organization, but your willingness to take on a less than desirable leadership opportunity may present chances for you in the future. And then philosophically, I would just remind everybody, because I've been in their position in many times in that mid-level group, is to transition from the lexicon they to we. Because we means you're bought into the organization, you're part of the institution, and you're willing to take risk and take blame and be a part of that organization. But there's, they did this and they did that, and we all know, because I certainly have for many years did it. I was they, but transitioning myself intellectually and philosophically to we. I'm now part of this team, and I will try to make the organization better. I can share a story with you. When I was a young aviator, and you're familiar with this, being an airman, I think the squadron commander was looking for somebody to be the CFC, the Combined Federal Campaign Officer, NCO, Stucky, and so I was a captain, and I was hanging around with a lot of flyers, and that was a lieutenant job, I think, at least from my perspective, a younger person's job. But I didn't have a leadership position in the organization, so I volunteered for it, and I stuck it out. And one of the reasons I volunteered for it is because my wife gave me that advice. She said, "Hey, volunteer for a less than desirable job, and maybe you'll follow itself. Your boss will realize that you're willing to take on the cruddy jobs, and maybe get a better job." And eventually led to becoming a flight commander in the squadron. And I would offer that was because I was willing to put myself out and to volunteer for a less than desirable job. So ask questions, seek others out, volunteer for less than desirable jobs, and certainly make that intellectual transition from they and them to we.
So, wow, there's a lot that I could absolutely draw out of that. I remember when I went to the senior non-commissioned officer professional enhancement course when I made master sergeant. One of the briefs that I got from the 3rd Air Force command chief, who at the time happened to be a TAC-P that I'd known for years.
Oh, you darn.
But he said he told everybody, he's like, well, welcome to them.
Yes.
And he's like all your whole career you said, yeah, they did this, or it's them, and blah blah blah. He's like, you are now part of that, which is interesting. And then one of the things that I've been fond of talking about is the Mayan hour. When I first signed up, I joined the Air Force, then eventually became my Air Force, and I was pretty happy with that. Then as I got a greater perspective, it became our Air Force, and I think that absolutely ties in to the they to we transition. So I absolutely love that advice. For people, just have the presence of mind beforehand to understand how that fits. I wish somebody would have told me that sooner.
Yes, I had to learn it through the School of Hard Knocks, and thankfully I had some good advice from my bride. But yes, I think it's sage advice, and it piggybacks on what you said.
You bet. And so so some of the things that we end up talking about here, and this is a very personal question for me. It's a conversation about leadership scar tissue, and that I worked for a lot of great leaders throughout my career, like amazingly impressive leaders, and I had just a handful of dirt bags that I ended up working for. But those dirt bags gave me so much scar tissue, for work. So there are things that I specifically do because of it, and specifically avoid doing because of it as well. And again, and I would also argue you can have good scar tissue, right? You get a heart replacement, and you're very proud and happy of that scar right there. So do you have any scar tissue, positively or negatively, that you would want to share? Because I think it's important for people to A, understand whether they do have scar tissue, and then B, communicate that with their leader, so the leader doesn't inadvertently scratch that scar tissue, without knowing any better.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Well, and as we both, I think, would agree, I've learned a lot more by making mistakes than I have had with successes. And obviously, most of our successes are due to the efforts of someone else, especially when we're in leadership positions. But true learning took place when I skinned my knees, or I scratched up my elbows because of something that I did personally. And the vignette I'll share with you is it started out as a youngster, and when I was going through officer training school. And we had to write up peer evaluations towards the end of the 90 days. And I took it upon myself to, rather than write a peer evaluation, I actually wrote a very critical personal critique of one of my fellow cadets. And fortunately for officer trainee Dillon, I was not kicked out of officer training school, but my flight commander came very close to kicking me out because of the lack of professionalism that I demonstrated by writing something down. And remember, this is pre-internet era. So the lesson was, first and foremost, be professional. Don't get personal, especially in an organization when you're involved in a profession, or that's the military or anything else, but always keep it professional, not personal. And then secondly, the impact of when you do write something down or draft up a electronic, in today's world, draft something up electronically or in social media, it's out there forever. And so that was one of the lessons that my flight commander had said, hey, you wrote this down. This could, I'm going to throw this, tear this piece of paper up and throw it away, and we're going to act like this never happened. But don't ever let this happen again, because you let your personal concerns and thoughts get in front of a professional. You and I have served with scores of individuals that we didn't necessarily agree with, but we can agree to disagree, but it's never personal. It's a profession. And so you have to figure out how to get along with everyone. And so that was a serious amount of scar tissue that I had. And I didn't realize how close I came to not getting an opportunity to serve in the Air Force because I let my personal thoughts cloud my judgment. So big leadership learning lesson as an officer trainee back in the day.
So, number one, I would argue, like, what an amazing way to get that out of your career early. So, like, lesson learned and done, so you don't have to suffer through that where it can impact more and more people. But along those lines, and or similarly, as a commander, how difficult or challenging was it to give people all that room to fail? They need to have those opportunities. You probably knew the right answer, but you probably knew that they had to find their own way too, and they needed those opportunities.
Right.
What advice would you have for leaders who truly do need to let people fail just because they need to learn some of those lessons?
You bet. I think the term we like to use, or I'll use today, is with delegation. You delegate. You let folks take opportunities inside your organization. It's part of their professional development. Give them those leadership opportunities and that room to make mistakes. Obviously you can't make mistakes unless you're actually doing something. We're very secure laying in bed and not doing anything, but we're not going to accomplish a heck of a lot not moving and not being active. And so members of your organization, especially if you want to see them develop and grow professionally, you have to give them opportunities. And I don't think my flight commander at the time knew I was going to really go way out on that limb and depart from professionalism, but I think he exhibited a lot of great judgment and forgiveness by allowing me to go way out there, and he didn't allow me. I did it, and then he allowed me to make a mistake. It wasn't a one mistake organization, and brought me back in. But that's key to professional development in any organization, is to delegate and allow folks to experiment, if you will, full well knowing in your CAPE framework, hopefully you've given them and helped manage their expectations. Yeah. Because as a leader, and that's incumbent upon you to do that. And if they don't succeed or they get scar tissue, one of the first things you have to do as a leader is, hey, did I not manage expectations correctly? I'd like to share, if I could, that brings to mind a vignette, probably that aligns with the expectation piece. Probably when I was listening to some of your thoughts and some of your comments, when I had the opportunity to take command of the 60th Air Mobility Wing at Travis Air Force Base, my boss at the time, Major General Winfield Scott, came out to the change of command ceremony, and he had the most pithy and probably brilliant comment in terms of expectation management right after the change of command. And he said, "Congratulations." And he was a big Civil War buff. And he said, "Congratulations, great ceremony, great event. Now move out and draw fire." And that was the only guidance he ever gave me, was that quote, "Move out and draw fire." And I thought how pithy and how it aligned so much with your expectation, because it was past, present, and future, all rolled up into that one thought. Great job, congratulations, you're now wing commander. Nice ceremony, that's the past. Present is nice ceremony, congratulations to you and your wife, well done today. And then he's got on the airplane, now move out and draw fire, and that's guidance for the future. And that really stuck with me, and made me, if nothing else, just want to learn a little bit more about Civil War history. But yeah, I had a lot of respect and really enjoyed serving for General Scott.
So in that moment, did you understand the significance of it? Was it a bit confusing? Do you understand it better now, or how did you react in the moment to that advice?
I understood the significance of it.
Nice.
I hadn't known him that well, but I knew of him and of those who had served with him, and so had a little bit of his background and his philosophy. But he was truly a hands-off, and as we were talking earlier about delegation, and he was truly a hands-off and expected you to be able to do your job and come up when you need some help, but otherwise it's a big boy, big girl program, and over to you. And call me when you need help. But I really enjoyed serving with him, and I understood his guidance at the time, and it was significant. And I've tried to rely on that a lot in the afterwards.
So I absolutely love that bit of advice, which kind of ties into, I think you could make a huge argument for contemporary Air Force society under General Goldfein, as far as if he's trying to revitalize squadrons and empower squadron commanders to go out there, and he's like, hey, stop doing things if it doesn't make sense, assess and accept risk and be able to articulate that so your leaders know. But how amazing that this is now coming a little bit full circle and as a lot more mainstream. What advice would you have for leaders? Go out, take fire, take risks, be bold. How did that play out for you in your time as command there, and the other different command times throughout the Air Force?
Yes. So piggyback on that, and great question. So within my first 60 days as being the commander at the 60th Air Mobility Wing, I had some significant challenges, and I occasionally talked to General Scott about it, but his guidance was very helpful. I had to remove a squadron commander from duty. I had a fire on the installation that burned up a couple hundred houses, and I also had a presidential stop. So within 60 days, I had these 3 big events, all of them high drama for the organization, but truly his guidance: move out and draw fire, don't sit back, let me know when you need help, basically. And a couple of times I had to ask for some help from the organization, but they truly let me run my organization. And so that was empowering to me, delegation of authority, and I always tried to replicate that. I thought I had done a good job in the past as a leader, but I really re-emphasize that going forward in other leadership opportunities, both when I was in command or the number 2 or even the chief of staff and future assignments. To always be respectful of delegating and empowering folks, but at the same time knowing your job and not being afraid to move out and draw fire.
So number one, I think it is amazing advice for everybody, especially as a guy on the ground got shot at. That's, I know exactly what that means. So moving past your experiences and your leadership abilities inside the United States Air Force, and now that you've taken that into the civilian sector and the civilian world, how similar or dissimilar, or what are some of the lessons that you've learned from the civilian world that you'd like to share with us, or vice versa? What are some of the things that you're trying to put into the civilian world that were distinctly military type lessons learned?
Yes, great question. So a couple of thoughts there. One, the United States military is the highest year in and year out. It's the most respected institution in America, and it has been for years and years. Gallup poll shows that the U.S. military is always held in high regard. Don't let that, though, confuse you with instant authority when you work and trying to work with your civilian teammates. They're just as capable, just as qualified, and probably more so. So don't confuse those two thoughts, that, hey, because I've been successful in the military, I'm instantly going to be successful in the civilian world. They have respect for you, but at the same time, you have to earn. I would offer you have to earn credibility in the private sector. You have credibility based on your past performance, but even within the military organization, you always had to prove yourself while folks respected you, they still wanted you to prove your mettle. And you probably experienced that firsthand when you got to McGuire and, hey, what's this TAC-P guy doing here? Charge of this big part of this big facility. So that's and I think that I anticipated that when I transitioned, but it's a good humbling experience to realize you're respected, but at the same time you have to prove yourself. So that's been helpful advice that I was given by others that I've learned and has helped me succeed working in the private sector.
Now, a little bit more on the personal side of things. Are there any, there's the common phrase, leaders are readers. And so I don't necessarily, I personally don't have time to read, but I do a ton of audiobooks. So I'm still digesting the information, but if I'm not out on my walks or hikes in the morning recording a podcast, I'm listening to audiobooks. And so what are some of the things that perhaps gives you inspiration, or what are those kind of seminal works that you would want people to read, to listen to watch, that is going to help shape them and benefit them for their leadership career?
Sure. A couple of things on that topic, and thanks for asking the question. I learned a long time ago, again, from individuals much wiser than I, that one of the things I read every day is I read the Wall Street Journal. And my wife, she was a student at the time, but she was getting copies of it, and so I started exposing myself to that. And I think I was at Squadron Officer College, maybe, or some PME, and I heard a speaker mention the same thing. There's so much information, as you know, out there in the world every day, and so just an area where you can go that sort of synthesizes a lot of information in a short period of time. And one of those is the Wall Street Journal. I probably spend about 15 minutes, 20 minutes a day. So not reading the thing cover to cover, but point number one, a book that I've enjoyed and reflected back on over time is by Daniel Kaplan. It's called Warrior Politics, Why Leadership Demands a Pagan Ethos. And so that seems sort of a strange title for, a practicing Catholic, why you would read something about leadership and pagan ethos. But I found it interesting, thought-provoking, because it does talk a lot about a lot of leaders over time, and it has a historical context to it. And so for the historically ignorant like myself, it allowed me opportunities to jump in and go, hey, I don't know that much about Winston Churchill. I'm going to go read a little bit more about him, or Machiavelli, or some historical figures. But it's a short read. It's one of those, quick read books, and I've reflected back on it several times over the years for different vignettes, and to make me think. And it probably demonstrates, as I mentioned earlier, my lack of. I'm not a history major, and I probably wish I was. But the older I get, the more I wish I would have read my history and studied my history. So I try to do that. But it was a good historical perspective book with some interesting, thought-provoking ideas about leadership.
Huh. I have not heard of that. I'm absolutely very curious. I get hooked on different things, and I have a subscription to Audible. So every month I get one book, Oh, nice. There we go. I'll write that down. So looking back on this, and, a lot of the times, a lot of the questions that I still get airmen writing me, like the young, airmen first class, senior airmen, and they're just looking for success. A lot of those questions are, hey, how am I supposed to communicate in a horrible environment? I've got a boss who just doesn't seem to care, just doesn't understand the human aspect, or realizing that if we're talking about the human weapon system, the first word is human. What is your advice to some of those people, and what are the things that they can do to help set themselves up for success?
So I'll take the question slightly differently, maybe looking at it as younger individuals, perhaps.
Sure.
So yeah, so just to suggest kind of some general thoughts about, again, about younger leaders, maybe. And so that's the way I'll take it. So twofold answer to that one is, and I think, be the best you can be. And then the second one is have a positive attitude. And I'll expand on a little bit on each one of those. So, and I think that would be those, especially for young people, and I think it'll make sense on your part of the question that asks about the communication piece and in a bad environment. So be the best you can be, whether it's a nurse, a technician, a mechanic, a teacher, a student. Have a strong work ethic. There was something that came out on the internet, a while back about top 10 things that require no talent, and hard work ethic is one of them. My dad, taught me that as a youngster. But I spent a lot of time, the older I got, finding sophisticated ways that showed that my dad was really as smart as he was. But I had to find my own ways of doing that. And I ran across a gentleman who was a Fortune 500 CEO when I was during one of my wing command tours, and I had the privilege of listening to him at a Better Business Bureau breakfast, and he came onto the wing and talked to the organization later on. But his presentation, and this was about hard work, and he basically said the two keys to success for him were hard work and luck, and a whole bunch of the former create a lot more opportunities for luck for the latter. So that really resonated with me, and it made sense as a young man growing up, because I had to work hard, and so that worked well for me. The other one was, the second one is having a positive attitude, and especially true for individuals in an organization that may not necessarily communicate the best or may have some leadership challenges, is individuals who are the glass half full type of folks, and we've served with several of them, they're always the exception. We're surrounded by a society of negativism and social media and you name it, but and not my idea. General Colin Powell, one of his 18 leadership principles was perpetual optimism as a force multiplier. And so individuals in your organization who are positive, not foolish, but positive and always looking at the bright side, regardless of the challenges, they are healthy and they're good for an organization, especially as a young person starting out, but for any leader, hard work and having a positive attitude are two key attributes, I think, that will help you even in a negative environment. So those two have stuck with me for a long time, and I think they're aligned with your with CAPE. I think there's alignment about perpetual optimism and being part of the organization and asking good questions, but having a positive outlook. So I think I might have heard it on one of your podcasts about if the glass is only half full, pour it into a smaller glass.
And I'm a huge optimistic person, and it's funny because I tell people, be awesome. If you're not being awesome, stop being non-awesome and start being awesome immediately. And one of the things, the vice commander when I was at 305th Air Mobility Wing, Colonel Brian Eade, he gave me we were talking about character. And he said, he goes, nobody can take your character from you, but you can give it away. It's the same thing with awesomeness.
Yes.
like you and you alone control that. Life's going to try and beat it out of you. The military could, or whatever organization you're in, situations are going to try and beat it out of you. But you can only give it away. It can't be taken from you. And I think that's absolutely phenomenal advice. And I think more people need to subscribe to that.
Organization want to be around you. They want to be around those positive people.
You bet.
Absolutely.
And
they are, as Powell said, they're force multipliers. They punch way above their weight.
And that's, for me, life, especially in a military context, life is tough enough. Life in the military is just unbearable. Life in the military during a time of war, and then heaven forbid deployed during that time of war, is almost unsurvivable. If you can't find the positive things, you're going to get lost quickly.
Yes. Amen to that.
Yeah, so that ends up being tough, but again, I think more and more people are getting there. So I think it's progressing and trending in the right direction. But again, I think one of the things I'm fond of is, I'm sure you've seen it. There's always the devil's advocate inside any organization, and time and time they're like, no, I'm just a devil's advocate. Hey, devil's advocate. I'm like, if you're always the devil's advocate, you're not a devil's advocate. You're an asshole.
Right.
like it's absolutely that plain and simple, and so it's funny. I would much rather have to calm people down from their huge positivity than this constant negativity. So it's always been a challenge.
Amen to that. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. So
along these lines, obviously your career, born of success, but really born of warfare. Setting the new standard for the C5 in a combat deployment. Multiple commands. You said all the stress within your first 60 days of your first wing command. I can't imagine how painful that is. One of the things that we end up talking about in contemporary society now is mindfulness. And one of the biggest mindfulness coaches out there, definitely in the Air Force, is Dr. Janelle McCauley, retired Lieutenant Colonel. She taught me to put on my oxygen mask to make sure that I'm right with me before I help the person next to me, which is absolutely smart. It's not selfish. It's a smart way of doing business. So what do you do to put on your oxygen mask, and what do you do to present the best Major General Mark Dillon to the world?
Hey, that's a great question, and I would agree with you, and I agree with Dr. McCauley, Colonel McCauley, that the mindfulness is a great way to think and act. Quite frankly, for me, personally, and we talk about it a lot. It's your faith, your family, and your friends. I would offer that. Get a lot of strength, bounce back oxygen, if you will, from those different organizations. Spiritually and emotionally, the faith journey I've been on, time spent with my family and being blessed, to have three wonderful sons and a beautiful wife and loving parents on both sides of our family and big family. And then actually finding, making, and continuing to have a relationship with good friends, both military and civilian. And so to me, those are reinforcements. Those are the oxygen that keep you going. And I think at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, if you want to look back on, what's written on your tombstone, if it circles around faith, family, and friends, you've probably done okay. Many of us are blessed with more, family and friends than others for whatever reasons. But at the same time, it's just, for me personally, at least, that's my oxygen, and I get good advice, and I get good counsel, and I get from all those three, from faith, family, and friends. So thanks for that question.
You bet. And again, I think that sums it up perfectly. Whatever that means for you. And again, I don't think neither you nor I are here to determine for somebody else what is their oxygen. I think that's a very,
Right.
Individual effort and individual understanding. But faith, family, and friends, I think is a good moniker, and a good phrase for them to understand and move forward. And it's probably one of the last questions that we would have out there. A very selfish question on my part. For as a staff sergeant, I got kicked off of a deployment and kicked out of this country and kicked out of my unit, and kind of found myself adrift for several years as I tried to find the new norm on who Tim Pachesa was. Was he right for the Air Force? And what his future was going to look like. What advice would you have for the people out there who have made significant mistakes in their career, and what they can do to perhaps recover, what they can do to perhaps just understand it at the time being, or giving them a little bit of a greater perspective on what that means in the grand scheme of things? What advice would that be to somebody who may be out there who's just trying to find their road to recovery?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. We've all experienced that ourselves, made, as you alluded to, and I mentioned earlier, we've all made dumb mistakes. You can't make mistakes if you're not trying. You're actually actively doing things. But I think first and foremost, realize that the thing that you did over time is probably not that significant. But at the time, it seems like it's the worst thing possible, because you have no space, no chance to reflect. And it just seems like the world's coming to an end, COVID-19. But over time, obviously, so it's not as bad as you think it is. And I've had many advisors remind me of that. Second thing is that over time, if you learn from that and figure out the positive, what should you have done? How could you have prevented it in the future? And as a leader, as we talked about earlier, how would you try to prevent your subordinates, the folks you serve with, prevent them from making a mistake? Try to give them some, additional guardrails that they may not have had, to delegate, but at the same time, provide some guardrails. So I think first, realize it's not that bad, as bad as you seem it is. And that's easily said, when it's not you that it's happening to.
Sure.
Time will heal, and learn something from it, and be able to share that with others as part of your leadership journey.
The big part of the reason I asked that question is right around the time frame that happened. If I were in your unit, you would have been my squadron commander. As far as how that shaped out, I would have been a staff sergeant in your unit. And so, I look back at that being a very difficult time in my life, both personally and professionally. And I absolutely own up to that my actions and everything that had happened. But it was weird because, you know, looking back on it from what I know now and have a greater perspective, my leadership viewed me as a criminal. What I did, what wasn't criminal. Yeah,
Right.
not at all. I got in a shouting match is what happened. But it was really odd because they weren't there to support me. You know, they weren't there to see that all this stuff happen. And so it was really, really odd. So I definitely appreciate that perspective from a personal sense, as far as how a leader would act in that type of situation. And again, the ability to separate the person from the act. And
Yes.
so I think that's exactly what you were talking about there. So
Yes, and to pile on to that too, Chief, as we've heard before, first reports are never 100% correct, and so not acting, as the leadership, not acting on those first reports. Oh, okay. Well, there's due process. There's a structure in the organization that will allow us to determine what really, let's allow that to play out, as opposed to shoot first and ask questions later. So there's time and a place for that, as you well know, but most of the times, unless you're in combat, probably not that case.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll draw this to a close. General Dillon, thank you so much for not only finding the time, but making the time to be here with us today. Thank you for your perspective. Thank you for your guidance. Thanks for being a great boss when I worked at headquarters PACAF as the vice commander there. I appreciate the conversations we had last month. And again, you being here today does me a great honor. And we'll turn it over to you for some closing comments, sir.
Well, I'd like to thank you, as we started off with, Chief. Thank you for putting yourself out there. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for providing a Chief Master Sergeant Senior Airman's perspective on leadership. You're attacking it from a lot of different angles, whether it's, what you call it, shit to Snickers, get in the car. I mean, I've looked at a lot of the titles of your podcast, and you're trying to get at that, CAPE leadership framework and from a lot of different angles, and it's a refreshing perspective. So thanks to you for doing that. Thanks for your service to our United States of America. And I just, for the military folks out there, thanks for their service, and God bless America. Greatest country ever, and proud to be a citizen and had the opportunity to serve in the world's greatest military. Thanks to you, Chief.
Awesome. Thank you for that, General. Thank you for everyone who tuned in today. And again, you heard it all. You heard about the caring, the alignment, the perspective, the expectations multiple times throughout this. So if you missed it, there's probably just something wrong with you, quite honestly. But we can talk about that later. And we can maybe talk about that later on the next episode of Leaders with Leaders. Thanks for tuning in. This is Chacha reminding you to always educate, anticipate, and dominate. We'll talk to you later, everybody. See ya.